Risk areas, like sex and drugs, those are difficult to talk about because those are areas before they're participating in those kinds of things or exposed to it. They love to talk about it. I'm never going to do that. And you'll hear all of that. And then all of a sudden it kind of goes quiet because now they're going to parties and they're seeing that and possibly doing stuff when they need conversation the most. That is when they need conversation the most. They can't talk.
So on difficult topics, sometimes we'll just want to start a conversation that's not as personal, because it is actually pretty natural that when you start, as this parent says, doing stuff like going to parties or becoming more sexually intimate or whatever, you don't want to tell your parents about it because you might get a lecture, you might get, a reaction that you don't want. So it's not even in their interest to share. So as parents, we still want them to talk about these difficult subjects, because by talking, they can almost start to imagine scenarios before they're into them, so they can have keep themselves safe or understand things in a more complex way than they would without the conversation. So the first thing I would say is use natural opportunities to talk about things that are going on in the community or at their school or in the news that still might help them get smart about a subject, and it's not about them. Because what we do is make it too personal when we're triggered by something we're worried about, and I think we should go more general. So for instance, we could talk about, hey, did you see that story about campus rape? Do you understand the difference between Title IX and going to a court of law? This is really complicated. And we make it an intellectual subject of what we know about this complicated thing about date rape, and then that you can't give consent if you're under the influence. So all sex is rape if the girl is drunk. This is really interesting. I do this in therapy all the time. I try to make it irresistibly interesting to be intellectual about this. And before you know it, you're talking about really heavy-duty issues: date rape, hooking up, alcohol use, and you're not talking about them. And that is what parents should be doing a lot of. We talk about things like dangers related to sex, drugs, and so forth. And it's like a psychological immunization. You're giving them a little toxin so that they can ward off the toxins in their life experience. So the smarter they are about all these things, and we started with campus rape, now we're talking about sex under the influence, now we're talking about consent. That's really interesting. The good thing about sex is always interesting. But you're staying intellectual about it. You're talking about law, and you're talking about the news story. And they are traveling into that realm, and you never had to make it personal. The second one I like is the educate me approach. Like you're trying not to look too intrusive, but you're trying to say, look, I was born a long time ago, and I've been hearing a lot about these drinking games, and sorry to be such a dunce, but what do you know? How do they get started? Do people bring in, is it always hard alcohol? Is it sometimes beer? And do they ever use hard alcohol with beer pong, or is it only beer? And you're not talking about them, but you're finding out what they know about. And there are drinking games that, of course, we're very concerned about as parents. And the use of hard alcohol is way higher than when we were teenagers. So by, say, educate me, tell me what goes down out there. Could you just let me know? I know I don't know anything. You're taking a one-down approach. And think about it. How often are we one down? Sorry, I'm kind of ignorant. Would you please teach me? That's an approach that really can get a conversation going. And we're still not personal. Because, again, I'm really emphasizing that when you say, something like, have you had sex yet? Or have you been drunk at a party yet? It's a loser from the get-go. It's just straight to, the nerve endings that will lead to failures. So that leads me to another technique, which is what I call the swirl-in, which means we start out here, that we might start by saying something about, there was a party where a lot of people were arrested. So what's going on there? Do you know how many people were busted or, arrested? And are they taking people into the the principal's office to find out who is involved and how much of a role the school is taking on? And are you worried about some of your friends? And, do you feel like you can be a support to some of those friends? And we haven't even talked about How much were you involved? Were you at the party? So sometimes we need to think about the issue. It could be suicidality. It could be depression. It could be a lot of things. But you want to start where it's not so personal to them. And then sometimes when they see that you're level-headed, cool-headed, calm, and receptive and really appreciative of what these kids are going through at, having been arrested, they're slowly but surely going to trust you with talking more. And sometimes teenagers have what I call, the telling tension. They do want to tell you about some things. So by swirling in and starting slowly, you're almost exposing them to an anxiety-producing subject. But as you're calm and collected and accepting and sympathetic, you are proving yourself to be, oh, this is a relief. I like this conversation. And they will tell you more and more because you've proven yourself to be trustworthy, to be level-headed. And then they actually want to tell you about these things. So when the parent has suspicion based on some evidence that they've been drinking or using drugs, that's one of those tough conversations. So you want, again, to start with an opening of saying, look, you're in 11th grade. I know you're out there. And now, having seen you last night, I didn't want to talk to you about it last night because, I think you were under the influence. But we need to have one of these tough conversations because, and then you fill in the blank. You were you were slurring your words, so I know that you might have been on your way to blood poisoning, or you used the car. At this point, we don't know where it will go. If the kid is defensive and hostile and runs out of the room, you're going to take one approach. If they're saying, yeah, Mom, but everybody does it, okay, could be worse. They could have run out of the room. You're saying, yes, I know a lot of kids do it, maybe not all, but a lot of kids are. So my concern is safety. So let's talk about some of your decision making because I'm not comfortable with your coming home in the state you were last night. Then he might say it wasn't that bad. You say, well, we might have two different opinions about that, but let's talk about safety. And then, from there on, I have to do a tree diagram because I don't know where it'll go. The key is to stay understanding, caring, and focusing on safety. And the more they say, I'm fine, don't worry about it, you're saying, well, that's not an option because I'm responsible and this is illegal behavior. I don't expect perfection, but we do need to have shared agreements. I give you freedom and you need to be competent with it. And when I see you under the influence, I know we've got a schism here, so we need to kind of return to our agreements and how we're going to make this work for both of us. It's a 7th grader. I am going to lower the boom, as a parent. That is 100% not okay because I know the earlier you start, if you find peers in 7th grade that are using, this is a serious problem. We will take one whole approach that will be entirely different than the mostly competent kid in 11th grade who might have been found for the first time under the influence. They're completely different approaches. That's why this parenting is not a one-size-fits-all premise. It all depends on the specific situation. I mean, the overall goal is to be effective, obviously, but what you're going to do with different kind of kids, one might be a risk taker across the board and you need a whole overhaul. One might be the 11th grader that came home under the influence. So you take a different approach. You're saying, I'm grateful that this is the first time you might have, overdone it, but it is a problem. We need to really talk about what went wrong yesterday that you did not know how to either be abstinent or limit or be in the safe zone. And then you might want to talk about, outside of my influence, outside of my orbit of influence, I know that you're not going to abstain, even though that's what I would prefer, because it's not legal till age 21. You'll be making your own decisions. My number one priority is safety. So we need to talk about what safety looks like for you at this point in time. So then you branch out into that. You can always start by saying, I would prefer abstinence because I feel like that's the legal premise, but I also want to be realistic. So we call this realistic parenting instead of perfect, that you're expecting perfect. So once you don't expect them to be perfect, you can maintain your position as preferring the ultimate safety, but then saying, but you're going to be making your own decisions. So let's talk about how you're going to keep yourself safe.